Speaker, I move that this bill be now read a second time. Speaker, to be absolutely clear, and I think I can speak for the member for Melbourne who's seconding this bill, we oppose the live animal export trade in the strongest possible terms. It is clearly systemically cruel. It's clearly not in Australia's economic self-interest, the way it has taken thousands of jobs, and it's unpopular, as evidenced by a number of opinion polls which show strong public support for shutting the trade down. In essence, this government's policy, the policy of the alternative government, are bad policies, and this shows a very worrying failure of governance in this country that we would allow, and in fact this government encourages an industry and a trade which is so wrong in so many ways, both ethically and economically. Now the government and the alternative government, they say to people like myself and the member for Melbourne that there's nothing to worry about here, that since the introduction of the Exporter Supply Chain Assurance System, or SCAS, that all is well, that now the trade is very well regulated, that we know where Australian livestock are going, we know that they're going through a supply chain of acceptable standards. But the reality is that SCAS doesn't work. We know it doesn't work because we are still seeing expose after expose of cruelty to Australian livestock in other countries. And only a month or so ago we saw the shocking revelations out of the Middle East and Malaysia during the Festival of Sacrifice. And we saw in that footage Australian sheep in particular being handled in the most dreadful way, in a way that no reasonable person, a person with any heart, could approve of. But what's the response? Next to nothing, at least in this place. And in fact, it's very interesting that no exporter has yet been prosecuted for the mistreatment of Australian livestock, even though this government, the alternative government, would say that all is well, and they keep coming back to SCAS. You know, SCAS has fixed it. Well, it hasn't fixed it. Hasn't fixed it in a number of ways. It's interesting, Speaker, that SCAS, and I've gone to the department's own material here, SCAS is based on 4 principles: animal welfare, control through the supply chain, traceability through the supply chain, and independent audit. But the problem is you can't achieve any of those principles when exported animals can't be properly identified. And that now goes to the essence of this bill, Speaker, the need to properly identify all livestock that is exported to other countries. And if I can just, Speaker, quickly read a summary of the situation with tagging as it now stands. In regard to cattle, all Australian cattle are required to have electronic ear tags as part of the National Livestock Identification System, which is a scheme run by the state and territory governments. The tags are required to be read when the beast leaves a farm throughout the supply chain until it reaches the port. But, and this is the crucial bit, Speaker, there is no requirement for the tag to be read after the animal leaves Australia. The beast is simply marked as exported after it gets on the boat, and no further information is collected. Speaker, the situation is even worse with sheep and goats. They are currently only required to have a plastic ear tag bearing the property identification code of the property where they came from. In other words, a tag showing a property number and each individual animal is not identified. And we've seen, Speaker, time and time again, when there is an expose, particularly in the Middle East where many of our sheep go, the tags have been ripped off, so they can't identify even what farm that property came from, and hence they can't identify which exporter was responsible for sending that sheep to that market. With other livestock, and people might be interested to know, we export a lot of camels, a lot of goats. Generally, under state and territory law, all livestock that leaves a property must be plastic tagged, like the sheep, with the property identification code, and the transfer must be registered in some way with the relevant state or territory authority. However, as with sheep and goats, there is no requirement that the tags be able to individually identify the animal. As with all exported livestock, including cattle, and as with all exported livestock, there is no electronic traceability of the animal after it's exported. So, in other words, Speaker, it's all well and good for the government to say SCAS has solved all of the problems, but it hasn't. And it hasn't for a number of reasons, and probably the most significant reason, other than perhaps a failure of political leadership to address this issue more broadly, SCAS hasn't solved the problem because our current tagging arrangements are completely and utterly unsatisfactory. We have cattle, as I read off there, that are electronically tagged, but there's no legal requirement for those tags to be read after the animals leave Australia. And sheep and goats and camels aren't even required to be electronically tagged. Well, Speaker, this bill will remedy that. This bill, and I hold out some hope that the government, the alternative government and the industry will at least give some measure of support to this bill. This bill will remedy things because it would require all livestock exported to be fitted with an electronic identification tag of a kind approved by the Secretary of the Department. And the data from that tag is to be collected and recorded at each stage during the live export process, including when the beasts and sheep and goats and camels are taken off the vessel in a foreign port, when they're transferred perhaps to a feedlot, when they're transferred perhaps to a market for sale, when they're transferred perhaps to an abattoir or a slaughterhouse. In other words, we will know, if this is done right, and it can be done right, where every single animal is at any point in time and exactly who's responsible for that animal. And that alone will go some considerable way to forcing the industry to clean up the act. There'll be no more ripping off plastic tags and suddenly a sheep's identity is lost. There'll be no more not using the electronic tag overseas. We will know exactly where every Australian-sourced animal is and who's responsible for it, and by implication, who's responsible for any mistreatment. Speaker, I'm doing what I'm doing today at the behest of a number of people in the industry. People who see the risks to their industry see that there are real problems with the industry, and unless they clean up their act, unless they can be seen to be acting more ethically, unless they can be seen to be minimising at least the cruelty to Australian livestock, they know that their industry is on notice. And I, for one, I will continue to do everything I can to see the industry shut down. So people might see a contradiction in what I'm trying to do here. In some ways, I'm trying to help the industry to put it on a more sustainable footing. I suppose what I'm doing ultimately is saying I will keep fighting to wind up the live animal export trade, but until we get a government that has a strong sense of integrity, until we get a government that has a clear understanding of the public interest and the national self-interest, until we get a government that's prepared to show a bit of strength and do what the public wants and shut this industry down, then let's at least do what we can in the interim to ensure that all livestock that are exported from this country are properly identified. And I think that will go some way to ensuring that animals are better treated throughout the supply chain. And then, and only then, the government will be able to stand up and say that SCAS actually means something, that the SCAS principles of animal welfare mean something, that the principle of control through the supply chain means something, traceability through the supply chain, it means something, and independent audit. But how can you even audit SCAS when you don't even know where our livestock are, who's responsible for them, where they're going? You can't audit it. So at the moment, until there's proper electronic tagging of all Australian livestock exported overseas, until there is proper electronic tagging, that will be completely hollow and just theatre. I noticed the Victorian government, to its credit, has just introduced, or is in the process of introducing, electronic tagging for sheep and goats born in Victoria from 1 January 2017. So good on the Victorian government. And again, yes, thank you, Member for Indi. And again, you know, how predictable and how upsetting to see our own Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Agriculture condemn the Victorian government. Speaker, I thank you for your time and I commend the bill to the House.